It's good to get back on our regular schedule, though. I'd like to say welcome to everyone, including those on the internet and some telephone hookups, hopefully. So we have a beautiful day here in Lincoln this afternoon, so hope everybody enjoys it. I have a little story I want to tell you that took place. It's a funny little story that took place up at Gatlinburg at the feast. I had the opportunity to work in the business office this year at Gatlinburg, and we met at the Rocky Top Sports Center, which was a real nice place to meet. Plenty of parking space, plenty of room for seating, even with some distancing. And on the first holy day, we had set up 3 boxes in the back of the hall on a table for and asked people to please place their holy day offerings in the boxes either before services or quickly after services. And on Sunday, Stan Martin and I had a meeting before services with a team of about 4 people that worked at the center as we worked on arranging things like Family Day and some other activities. It's the first time we'd ever been there, so we had to work some things out. They were real nice people and bent over backwards to help us out in every way they could. When our meeting was about over, the head guy over the hall said he had a story he wanted to tell us. And he said he and 2 workers were walking through the hall the previous day before services, and one of the guys saw those boxes sitting on the back table, and he started screaming, saying, "Let's get out of here, let's get out of here." And rapidly started to exit the area, and the guy stopped him and said, What's wrong? What's going on? And he said, "Those boxes over there." Said, "These people must be rattlesnake handlers." Said, "That's where they keep their rattlesnakes." So we got a big laugh out of that. And he had some more stuff, but I'll tell you that later sometime. But that was pretty funny. I had a friend who always said he was born 100 years too late. He watched Western movies and Western TV shows back in the late 50s and early 60s, like Bonanza and Wagon Train and Gunsmoke, where Matt Dillon always kept the bad guys at bay. And he would have loved being sheriff in one of those small towns. But if he lived today, he might have changed his mind, because we are certainly living in times that comes close to being equal to the settling of the Old West as far as transition and importance is concerned. As Scott Ashley wrote in the editorial for the current issue of Beyond Today magazine, in his article, An Unrecognizable America, he said, "Beyond Today does not endorse any political party, but we are compelled to address the reality of where the nation is at the moment. The stakes are high because what is at play is the survival of our nation as we know it." And it is. Mr. Kubik called it, we're at a crossroads. Let's look at one of the many things that Jesus said about the situation before his return. We have all read and meditated on Matthew 24, but let's look at verse 36 and 37 again. It's also in Luke 17:26. Get Francis to bring my water bottle up here, if you will. I'm a little dry. I got in a fire ant nest when I got here this morning. So if I start dancing around and doing a little jig, it's not because of anything except fire ants. We're looking at Matthew 24. And we're going to start in verse 36. This is where the disciples had asked Jesus about his coming, and this is part of his answer on down in his answer. Verse 36, he says, "But at that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." And then he goes on to give us more detail. But I was just wondering and asked if you ever thought maybe while meditating sometime, why did God have Noah build an ark in the first place? He could have destroyed the people and protected Noah in several different ways. He could have protected Noah and his family like he did Lot when he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. I think Peter had it figured out in a section in the New King James in 1 Peter subtitled Christ's Suffering and Ours, when he commented on the days of Noah. I actually got my title today, Divine Long-Suffering, from this verse. 1 Peter 3 in verse 20. Who formerly, he's talking here about the suffering of Christ, and this is on down into the verse a little. I'm just cutting in at verse 20. Who formerly were disobedient, when once the divine suffering waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 souls, were saved through water. The 1611 King James leaves out the word divine and just says, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared. God gave the people 120 years to change, long suffering all the while. But all they did was to make light of Noah's work and harass him. They made no attempt to listen to Noah's preaching, and he was a preacher of righteousness. Long suffering is a fruit of the Spirit, listed in along with the others in Galatians 5:22. Of course, when we talk about the fruits of the Spirit, we're talking about God's Holy Spirit, and when he exercises his Spirit, it is divine, or as Merriam-Webster's dictionary says, godly, divine or godly. I looked up the word divine in Merriam-Webster's, and his first definition is of relating to or proceeding directly from God as divine love. Of course, love is the first fruit of the Spirit, and so God's love is definitely divine. We call it agape love from the Greek word, but it's great love. As at different times we talk about or study and developing the certain particular fruits of the Spirit, but it certainly may be appropriate at this time that the time that we're living in to be developing godly long-suffering. As Peter put it, divine long-suffering. Mr. Kubik usually begins his weekly e-news message with, "Hello, brethren," or "Dear fellow servants of God." But last week, right after the election, he began with, "Dear United Citizens." I thought that was interesting. I thought he might be writing not only to the church, but maybe a message to the whole country, which would have been good. The whole country should have read it. But I want to read an excerpt that was definitely intended for the church. He wrote, What was Peter's advice, he asked. What was for Peter's advice for people living in these dangerous times? And then he quotes, he says, "Be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then, even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honorable behavior, and they will give honor to God when he judges the world." It's 1 Peter 2:12 in the NLT. And then he said, that's a high and challenging calling. And so it is a high and challenging calling. If we can develop divine and godly long-suffering, it will help us with getting through and answering the situation that we live in, and give us peace. And although we may have answers to some of the things we see, don't be too quick and snappy to answer, but think it through first. As the old saying goes, put your brain in gear before you put your mouth into motion. Earlier I mentioned Mr. Scott Ashley's editorial. He ended the article this way in his last two paragraphs. These are dangerous times. The ground is shifting underneath our feet. Prophecies of a very different world, one in which the United States no longer would exist as a viable nation, are lining up. And he continues, what should we do? Pray, draw close to God, prepare yourself spiritually for what lies ahead. Read this issue carefully and continue reading and watching beyond today. Understand what you need to do. I meant to bring a copy of that and show it, but there's some awesome articles in that current issue. It was prepared especially for the times that we live in. And Mr. Preston's letter yesterday evening was a perfect parallel to what Mr. Ashley was saying. Talking about finding the biblical model. God's long-suffering in the days of Noah is a perfect model for the long-suffering that we need to be doing now. It's a perfect example. And there are other examples, many examples, but that's one good example. One thing that I have learned in this life is that when there's trouble, it's 95% of the time, it is much better to concentrate on how to fix it than to concentrate on what caused the problem. Generally, we know what caused the problem, and most of the time it goes back to one source. And we know what the source of problems is, especially for the church, our accuser. I believe that God works that way too. For example, when we sin, he knows what causes the problem, so he concentrates on redemption, fixing the problem, and instructs us on what to do. God knows what caused the problem that we have in this country right now. And he has a plan of redemption. And again, obviously, exercising divine long-suffering. If he wouldn't, we might see some fire and hailstones falling or something. But he is definitely practicing long-suffering right now. He just don't reveal to us as many details as we would sometimes like to have, and we tend to get impatient. We don't need to do that. But he always gives us enough of an oversight for us that we know overall what to expect. One part would be to exercise divine long-suffering and watch. Our part would be to exercise divine long-suffering and watch for his plan to see how it works out. Moses put it this way: stand still, or you could say exercise long-suffering. He said, stand still when the Egyptians were crossing the Red Sea. He said, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord.